Yes, thank you everyone for having me today. Our panel is on reimagining communities, and today I'm going to be focusing on the themes of Jewish identity and Hebrew Christian identity in the late 1800s and early 1900s through our analysis of the David Barron collection. There have been a few hiccups, like our video not being available for today. Also, I was trying to print out my notes and my computer completely crashed and deleted all of them a few days ago. So pardon me for reading off of my phone for some parts of this. But yes, okay, let's get started. And also a thank you to Michelle, because she has been a really great supervisor on this, and it's been an amazing opportunity. So I've had the opportunity to present this talk today through the Applied Humanities Employability and Practice course that's offered to second-year humanities students here at CCCU. And yes, me and another student, Daniel Randall, were able to work on this. He worked on this through the Digital Humanities course. He was able to digitize the collection, which is around 15 items, creating 3D images of all of them, as well as redoing the David Barron Wikipedia page. And he's currently working on writing an article for Kent Maps Online. Through this, I was able to create the video that goes through the collection and talks about the purposes of each of the objects. So who exactly were the Hebrew Christians? We're going to get to David Barron in a minute, but this is a really important question to first answer. It's kind of a foreign term for a lot of people, but Hebrew Christians were a relatively small group of Jewish-born converts to Christianity in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And they were mostly practicing their Christianity within their own groups and denominations. They used a lot of Jewish culture and religious practices in their faith and in their theology, and it was really formed around a lot of that. So I do have to make the statement that for the purpose of this talk, Hebrew Christians should be seen as Christians and not a sect of Judaism, because of the differences between the religions when observing the issue of the Messiah. Hebrew Christians, that's why they're used with the term Christian instead of Christian or Jews for Jesus or Jewish Christians. So to fully understand the differences and intricacies of these two belief systems, we would need to explore over the 4,000 years of Jewish history and over 2,000 years of Christian theology, which we're just not going to have time for today. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. And if there's anything that you need clarifying, please do ask me. But it is also needed to be understood that Judaism is a religious, cultural, and ethnic identity, and it's all formed by this very long and complex history and heritage. One area of Jewish history that we can focus on is the history of anti-Semitism in Europe and the pogroms of the late 19th century, as these were really coinciding with a lot of David Barron's lifetime. So the pogroms were calculated attacks carried out against Jewish communities, primarily in Eastern Europe, by non-Jewish members of the community, the vast majority of who would have identified as Christians. So these events are important to focus on, especially when David Barron would often go to places where pogroms had happened in Eastern Europe. The pogroms are fresh in the memories of Jewish immigrants to England during this time, and understandably, many Jewish people felt like they could not fully trust their Christian neighbors after the treatment they had experienced, not just in recent years following the pogroms, but also in the hundreds of years of anti-Semitism that's existed in Europe. This sets up the historical context of the time period we're looking at. It's one strife with discrimination, but interestingly enough, it is also one of innovation and imagination within the Jewish community. This time period coincides with what's known as the Halaska, or the Jewish Enlightenment, which David Barron is seen as being a part of through the Hebrew Christian branch. So who was David Barron? David Barron was born in 1855 in the then Russian Empire to two Jewish parents, Mordecai and Saka, and he had a very traditional and well-educated Jewish upbringing. He was even considering becoming a rabbi as a young man. He ended up immigrating to England as a young man with a relative. Even though they were meant to go on to America, he was unable to continue his journey past Hull. And so he stayed in England, and this is where he first interacted with Christianity. Shortly after his arrival, he actually ended up converting to Anglicanism and making his way down to Dover, where he met a woman named Fanny Kingsford, who was a part of the Kingsford family of Dover, who were very influential in the area. And here's where we see a lot of the Kent ties with Dover. Or the Kent ties with David. So Fanny Kingsford was actually involved in the Christian mission to Jewish communities in Kent for a long time before meeting David Barron. And the two of them together ended up starting, along with some of their contemporaries, what is called the Hebrew Christian Testimony to Israel in London. This organization basically worked to mission to different Jewish communities across the UK and Europe. And through this, David Barron was able to become very well traveled. Like I said earlier, he went to many places in Eastern Europe and was also stationed up in, I think, Glasgow or Edinburgh for a while. Outside of his missions to Europe, Barron was also had the chance to visit Jerusalem, where the contents of our collection come from. So as Michelle said in the introduction, the collection is now a part of the CCCU Library Archives and was donated by family of David Barron and Fanny Kingsford. The collection contains 15 objects stored in a suitcase, as well as a card that lists 12 of these objects as being associated with a biblical verse or verses. And I have a picture of it here. One of the examples we can see is a tear bottle from Psalms 56:88, where in the poem it mentions collecting your tears in a tear bottle. I think we also were able to find a few verses in the New Testament that coincided with that as well. But as you can see, some of these, like with the door sign, it's connected to Deuteronomy 6, 8, and 9, and Matthew 23:5. So what we think this list is a list created by David Barron, and he is associating what are 12 of the objects with different biblical verses. And for this one specifically, Deuteronomy is taking the door sign, which is a commandment given to the Jewish people, which is a mezuzah placed on a door at an angle, and then connecting it with Matthew, where Jesus is criticizing leaders of his time for kind of flaunting these objects, but not having the morality alongside using these themes. So it's a really interesting look at kind of these comparisons being drawn between two objects. So the inclusion of these verses seems to suggest parallels between two biblical works in reference to the objects. I go far more into detail with all of these in the video that we created, which will be available probably on YouTube at a later date from the library. But the initial interpretations of the collection suggested that the items were primarily souvenirs from Israel. And while many of them were probably obtained from what we now see as tourist shops or stalls in Jerusalem, the addition of the biblical associations suggests the collection served a more complex purpose. One primary theory is that the collection was used as a tool in David Barron's preaching or as sermon props when he was going for his missions. And these would be used to help visualize some of his arguments that he was trying to make. So many of these objects would have been very recognizable to Jewish people of his time and today, as they're objects commonly used in daily Jewish life, such as a mezuzah, as I was talking about before, or the sign on a doorpost. And another aspect of this collection that makes it quite remarkable is the survival of these items associated with Judaism and Jewish life through the Holocaust. They are fairly well preserved objects coming from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and because of their preservation in England at the time, we still have great examples of Victorian Judaica. There are some implications that go along with this collection. Like most of the subjects covered through the analysis of the Hebrew Christians, some of the implications we can draw out of Barron's work, using the collection as an example, are quite complicated. On one hand, Barron's use of items associated with Judaism and Christianity can be seen as a unique form of drawing comparisons between two groups. It can also be seen as a form of interfaith dialogue when we're using it today, highlighting our similarities rather than our differences. However, on the other hand, the collection also raises many questions surrounding the Hebrew Christian mission work and proselytization to Jewish communities. This is not meant to offend or critique fully David Barron's own beliefs or those of the Hebrew Christian movement out of their personal theology. And I do truly believe that David Barron really genuinely wanted to help his community through his proselytization. But the questions and concerns that arise are more from an understanding of the attitudes of the Jewish people who Barron would have been preaching to. So, as I mentioned before, not only did Jewish communities have a sense of distrust of Christian groups because of anti-Semitism of the time, but there's also distrust of proselytization as well. because of Judaism's own perspectives on seeking converts. I'm using an example from Ralph D. Mecklenburger, who's from the Spiritual Abuse Resources, and he was explaining his take on the Jewish perspective of proselytization, saying, "Our attitude has been and overwhelmingly remains that we accept individuals who come to us," and that would be for conversion, "but not to actively recruit would-be converts." While Judaism also understands that key aspects of other religions is to be able to share their good news, Mecklenburger also describes how Jewish people feel disrespected when other groups try to proselytize to them when Judaism actively disapproves of Jewish evangelizing. He goes on to say that proselytizing may be ethical insofar as it opens choices to people, provided that they are entirely free to accept or reject what is being offered to them. Ethical proselytizing requires that people be told the truth up front, and then be given full and honest answers to whatever questions they may have as time goes on. This opens up proselytization to become much more of a dialogue between people, something that I believe that the collection is a very good tool to be used for today. It can be used to create conversations and questions between religious groups, as long as they're done in a respectful manner. Mecklenburger also provides insight into an example of the Jewish perspective of Hebrew Christians as well. And this is a modern perspective, but I do think it can be used to apply to kind of further understanding the context, the cultural context behind this. He says, Jews, for instance, are annoyed and offended by self-styled Hebrew Christians, Jews for Jesus, and the like. An individual is free to choose to be a Christian rather than a Jew. If he then says that he has not left the Jewish fold, and then uses his former Jewish status to woo Jews, he is distorting both Christianity and Judaism, each of which is a distinct and separate religion. And really, again, this comes down to kind of key aspects of both Judaism and Christianity being the issue of the Messiah. While Christianity very clearly sees Jesus as the Messiah that is called in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, Judaism does not. Judaism does not see Jesus as the Messiah at all. So that is a key aspect of both religions that even though we can see these cultural similarities throughout the collection, that's when that clashes. And here Mecklenburger is saying that by holding on to these two identities, it is a form of disrespect to both religions and both religious identities in that manner. So how can we incorporate our understanding of the historical and cultural context of the time with the analysis of David Barron and the Hebrew Christians? Now that we have this understanding, we can look at David Barron and the Hebrew Christians as being people who are seeking change in their own communities. If that change was wanted or asked for, it is a separate matter in the communities that we're being missioned to. But David Barron's collection, alongside his greater works with the Hebrew Christians, is an example of the highly contentious joining of two separate ideologies and traditions within religion. I think aside from the implications of their work that their work does have, today we can at least learn from them and the opinions of Jewish people to better understand interfaith dialogue that we can have today surrounding this topic. Our theme for this panel is Reimagine Communities, and in a time where so many Jewish communities were being changed and dismantled by anti-Semitism and increasing immigration, the Jewish people were able to form new communities in these new locations through their shared identity with Judaism, the oppression that they faced, and the resilience that they exhibited. And in their own way, the Hebrew Christians were also a product of this time, a group that were attempting to reimagine the religious identity and beliefs of their own communities in a different way, joining together their Jewish heritage and their new Christian beliefs to form a new identity, contested though it may be. So, thank you very much. I hope that this was informative and also gives people a chance to think about how we can treat interfaith dialogue today by looking at David Barron's work and the collection. So thank you very much.